I mean, the only warning is that the Scots are quite blunt people, so you probably get some.
We have a few friends that are Scottish, so we're well prepared for this.
Hey, welcome to Super Social Club. I'm Jeremy.
This is Whiskey in the Six. I'm Rob.
Welcome to the Whiskey Rant Podcast.
It's a little crusty.
It's frustrating.
And it's going to be a little bit of a rant.
I don't understand it. I don't know why.
Some sort of injustice.
Anyway, end rant.
Hello and welcome back to the Whiskey Rant Podcast. I'm Jeremy.
I'm Rob.
And tonight we are joined by one of the master distillers, the up-and-coming distillery in Canada. Graeme Macaloney joins us. Graeme, how are you tonight?
Very good, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So this distillery is coming with some pedigree already. Quite a few awards. You guys just, I'm looking at some of the awards. Am I getting this right? You have 5 golds in recent years?
Yeah, well, I think the count's increased on that one. We put our whiskies into the World Whisky Awards in London because they're blind tastings by experienced judges. And so you can't buy your way into it. And so I think we've got 6 or 7 gold medals now, including world's best. But when I say 6 or 7, that's 6 or 7 Canadian best, and then we've got a couple of world's best as well.
Awesome. So I think it was it the Kildare that got world's best?
Yes, it was. We got, that's our first world's best fully fledged whiskey. We actually won a couple of world's best awards for some of our moonshine, or as the Scots call it, clearich, or new make as others call it. And we put some of our peated new make into World Whisky Awards into that new make category, and it won world's best. But this is the big breakthrough for us because the Kildare is a fully fledged whiskey. It took on the pride of Ireland and beat the pants off them.
So for people that don't know, tell us about your story because it is very interesting. You guys are situated in Victoria, BC, so the far west coast of Canada. How did you come about starting up a distillery there?
So succinctly, if I can be succinct, when I was a wee lad back in Scotland, I had a summer job in the black and white whiskey factory. And I was interested in biology and microbiology, and so that inspired me to go off to university and study fermentation. The prof said I should upgrade, so I did a biochemical engineering degree and eventually did a PhD in fermentation. And I thought I'm all set to get a job in the whiskey industry, and applied for jobs, and they told me to bugger off because I was overqualified. So I found out that PhD actually stands for piled higher and deeper. So I ended up in a fermentation career. All the while, I remained a connoisseur like yourselves, a whiskey geek like yourselves, and worked through big pharma in fermentation. That brought me out to Canada in biotechnology, and that got me into venture capital funding and working with angel investors. And after doing all of that and still being passionate about whiskey, I thought, hey, I can create a job for myself. Why don't I just build a distillery and create a job for myself? And of course, you have to raise a bunch of money on the way because I'm not independently wealthy. So I had to figure out how to raise money from angel investors and whiskey enthusiasts. And so we set about raising money from Canadians to build a Canadian distillery, from Canadian whiskey enthusiasts, I should say. And so that's how we got to where we are, if you will.
Very cool. And you brought along some very reputable people in the industry as well. Tell us about your partners who help you out distilling.
Yes. Consultant master distiller, Mike Nicholson. Mike was a Diageo man all his life. His dad and granddad were distillers. His father-in-law was a whiskey blender. So it's in his genes. He worked in 18 different Diageo distilleries as a master distiller with Lagavulin, Kalila, Blair Athol, Glenkinchie. And he thought he was retiring to Vancouver Island until I found him and dragged him out of retirement, happily so. Now he's gone back into retirement again because, we're a few years into this now. But he was great because as a master distiller, he helped us design and commission the plant. But then the key secret of a master distiller is running the process with batch to batch consistency. That's what the magic is of a master distiller. They make sure the quality of the spirit is the same all the time, given all these different variables. The other key person that I brought in was the legendary, the late, great Dr. Jim Swan.
Yes.
And Jim Swan was a PhD chemist. So he's, in a sense, your mad scientist, researcher who was an expert in whiskey chemistry. And what Jim did, which was absolutely astounding, was he was an internal consultant for the Scotch Whisky Research Institute. That meant he visited every single distillery in Scotland, whether it was a grain distillery, single malt distillery, it didn't matter. He visited them all as an internal consultant. Finally, and he watched with a scientist's mind the best practices. And then finally went independent and became a consultant. And he helped Cavallan win World's Best in 2015 with a scabby 5-year-old whiskey, for goodness sake, right? I mean, the Scots were like, what? You got to be bloody joking. You've beat us with a scabby 5-year-old and you're from Taiwan with no history of whiskey making? And so when I saw that, I thought, okay, Jim Swan's the man for me. So I thought, okay, I'll phone him up. He's in Edinburgh, I'm in Victoria. And I thought I'll interview him and bring him on as a consultant. And he grilled me for 45 minutes on the phone before he said, yes, I'm prepared to come and work for you, Graeme.
That must have been quite the interview for you to go through a 45-minute grill fest from such a legend in the industry. So good for you, I guess, to land his expertise.
That's it.
And the wonderful thing about him was that for all his, he's been called the Einstein of whiskey, right? And for all his expertise, he was a wonderful, humble, gentle man, right? And so when he came out here to commission the process, design the process, and then when I traveled with him through Kentucky and Portugal and Spain to build the relationships for the whiskey casks, it was one PhD scientist talking to another mad PhD scientist. And I just learned so much from him. It was fantastic. It really was.
So you touched on it. So I had this question that I would have asked later, but since the topic is there, these casks, my goodness, like, how old this is? Like, I'm guessing it's between, it says whiskey on the bottle, so it's at least 3 years old. Maybe it's up to what, 6 years old? But like the color on this whiskey and the quality too, like it's not just, you can tell that you've sourced incredible casks for this. So yeah. Anything you can share about these Spanish casks and the relationship you built in Spain over here?
Yeah, no, for sure. So, for me, I think the reason why Jim accepted me as his consultant was that for me, I was all about wanting to do a traditional single malt process, but that it would be the best that a Scotch single malt can be. Obviously, we're doing Canadian single malt, but he figured out the best practices of traditional Scotch making for single malt whiskey. And when he saw that I was aspiring to do that and to specialize not in funky mash bills, right, not in other funky ways, but specialize in wood, that was music to his ears because he had built relationships with the best cooperages and bodegas. And so when Jim said to me, he said, look, Graeme, don't worry about it. I'll order the wood for you. I'll get you the same wood that Glendronach and Macallan and Glenfarclas, the same sherry wood that they use. I'll get you the best Kentucky wood. I'll get you my special Shave Toast Rechar wood, which we'll talk about later if we've got enough time. And I'll order that wood for you, Graeme. That's part of my service. And I said, no, Jim. And this was kind of really sadly prophetic because I said quite naively, I said, Jim, you're not going to be around forever. So why don't I'll take the extra time and effort and expense to travel and visit with all of these cooperages and bodegas, and you can introduce me. I'll keep working with you as long as you'll keep working with me, but I do want to establish that direct relationship and get to know these suppliers and share with them my aspirations for top quality. And it was a phenomenal trip. It was a phenomenal trip. And not just in terms of, all of these cooperies and bodegas, interestingly, are family businesses. That's kind of cool, right? So their soul and heart are invested in these businesses. It's not some anonymous corporate business that you're dealing with, their family. And they really cared about the fact that I took the time to go visit them. And a little funny anecdote was I was about to place an order. I just placed an order for some of the Portuguese shaved toast rechar red wine barriques. And it was a big order. It's my first ever order. I think it was like almost 100 barriques, which was a massive order for me to invest in. And Jim went over and quietly said to me, Graeme, do you mind if I place an order for Cavalan? I said, no, that's fine, Jim. That's no problem. He said, oh, and I'd like to order 1,000 barriques for Cavalan, please. And my jaw dropped. My jaw dropped, right? I thought 100 casks was a big order, and here he's ordering 1,000. But the owners of that bodega, that cooperage, they said, Graeme, they saw how shocked I was and said, Graeme, don't you worry. We will always make sure that you get the best quality wood from us, irrespective of the size of your order, because you've made a personal commitment to come visit us, and now we've got a relationship, right? So yes, so we get the best wood that money can buy. It's expensive, it's not cheap, but there's no color added. Coming back to your original question, that all of that color is coming from the wood, right? There's no artificial color there. And as you guys know, Clearach is called Clearach because the Gaelic speakers in the Highlands didn't have a word for clear, so they added ach on the end, and Clearach comes off clear like water, and that's why they call it Clearach, right? And so all of that color is coming from the wood, and if you've got great wood, you're going to pull out some great color, and the flavors with it, of course.
What do you think the key is? Because obviously you're bottling a lot of stuff at a younger age. Would you say it's an equal part cask to distillate quality, the quality ingredients? Where would you rank as far as cask quality is concerned, distillate quality, or even, the quality of the barley itself? What makes a whiskey really good at a really young age?
That's a great question. And, for all of my degrees in science and engineering, what I love about whiskey making is you'll never tame it. You'll never figure it out completely, right? There's so many variables, and they all have their different impacts. I think what I learned from Jim and like yourselves being astute observers of the quality of young whiskies from other old distilleries and new distilleries, tasting their moonshine or Clearach and pulling that all together, what I feel that Jim brought to the table was when he dialed in and optimized a single malt Scotch process to be the best that it could be, the spirit, the Clearach that came off was super smooth. It wasn't hot and fiery, so it doesn't have to spend years being tamed by the charcoal in a cask and by oxygenation in a cask. Super complex and super fruity because he does a very narrow cut on his pot stills and very slow distillation on the pot stills. So you're really focusing in the tropical fruits and the floral notes with those volatile esters, if you will. And then when you combine that with Canadian barley, which is way better than that Scottish crap and the English crap, right? And the crap that they might buy in for Europe, Canadians make the best barley on the planet.
Wow.
And what it does for me is it kills my economics because I get less alcohol from Canadian barley compared with English and Scottish barley, but I'm getting bigger flavors. I'm getting big juicy malt flavors coming through in the new make. So now you've got big bold flavors from the new make from the Canadian barley. I've got stuff to jam packed in there, lots of floral and fruity esters from the cuts and slow distillation. And heck, it means you don't have to mature it for 12, 15 years for it to be great, 20 years for it to be great. This stuff is proven itself in 3, 4, 5 years. So absolutely the Jim Swan method is a major contributor, but the Canadian barley is absolutely in there too. And yes, I mean, you could put great spirit into crap wood and it'll sit there and kind of, not do a lot. So you've got to buy really good wood. The reverse is true. If you've got crap spirit, let's not call it crap. Like I've tasted a lot of Scotch new make as part of the research before I built the distillery. And when I benchmarked our new make, what I found was that most Scotch new make from the older guys, the established distillers, is kind of two-dimensional and a bit hot, right? And so it takes that 10, 12 years to build in a third dimension of complexity and to smooth it out and whatnot. So it's not crap, right? I shouldn't use that word because it ends up being great whiskey. But if you've got that kind of two-dimensional stuff where it's a bit hot and you put it into a cask, it's going to take a long time for the cask to even out and add the complexity and smooth the whiskey out and whatnot. So you've got to have the both together. You've got to have the great new make spirit, the clearich, and you've got to have really top quality wood to be able to marry them together.
So you ran into some issues with Scotland at some point because of, personally, my thoughts and our sentiment is that they could tell that you guys were onto something very, very good. You want to speak to that a little bit, or?
Yeah. So what specifically what happened was the Scotch Whisky Association, who are funded by big spirits in Scotland, right? I mean, the 16 board members, I think 9 of them are controlled by the 3 or 4 biggest Scotch companies on the planet, and they filed a lawsuit saying you're trying to pass off your whiskey as Scotch because you're using a Scottish sounding name called Macaloney.
Right.
You're using the word Caledonian, which was the original name for British Columbia, but it's also the original name for the Highlands of Scotland that the Romans called the Highlands of Scotland. But it was a really cool local story to tell tourists that the British Columbia used to be called New Caledonia once upon a time, because of all the settlers loved the scenery out here. And then I used the verboten word Glen in my whiskey because I'm a bit of a historian and I name my whiskies after my family history, and my family lived for 1,000 years in a glen called Glenloy. And so Scottish Whisky Association lawyers, I can understand why they did it, right? They've got to defend, the branding of Scotch. I don't blame them for it. But they argued that because I'm using Glen and Caledonian and Macaloney, and even the word island, they were arguing over as well, that we're trying to persuade Canadians that this was really Scotch instead of Canadian single malt. So we came to an amicable resolution. I can see their arguments, and so they let us keep my name Macaloney. They let me keep the name Island because we're on an island. Vancouver Island is spectacular, and if, I don't know if you'll agree with this or not, but I really do genuinely believe that we've got island ocean notes in our whiskies. Some of them actually they dry off at the back end, and some of them have, I think, a hint of salt in them. Right? When I drive to work in the morning, I can smell the ocean breeze. The ocean is 2 kilometers in a couple of directions from this distillery. So we kept Island, we kept Macaloney, and we gave up the 2 Scottish-sounding Glenloy and renamed it Anloy. And everyone's happy and it's amicable, and we're all moving forward quite happily. So
it's disappointing because they must think Canadians, like the condescension behind these kind of lawsuits it's like, do you think we're that stupid?
Well, you're not the first. Obviously, Glen Breton was a big one too, right? They came after Glen Breton for that.
So the thing with Glen Breton is like we're talking at a time where maybe whiskey wasn't anywhere near as popular as it has been in the last 7-8 years.
Yeah.
All of a sudden we have a distillery in Victoria, BC that's on an island.
Right.
Using
Graham's using his own name, his own personal name.
Like the condescension
you can't do that.
No, you can't use your name.
You're gonna think people are gonna think this is Scotch.
You can't use the word island. What do you think? The Scots own that word.
Right.
it's the I mean, we have a laugh at that quite often, and I honestly believe that a lot of the reason why they pursued you guys in particular is because they tasted the quality that's coming out of this distillery, and they felt threatened.
Yeah, Graeme, did you anticipate this coming from them at all? Did it take you by surprise, or would you kind of expect maybe you'd hear something from them?
No, totally not. I mean, you know, like it was a shock when it came through,
Yeah.
and I lost a lot of sleepless nights.
Yeah.
You know, a small pre-profitable distillery that's having to spend a fortune on maturing whiskey, and it's going to be years away before we can actually break even to get served a lawsuit. Like, you know, I was shit myself, right? And then of course I had to, you know, I knew we had to defend ourselves, and I had to go find one of the highest powered lawyers in Canada, right? They don't come cheap. So there was a lot of sleepless nights. But as I came to terms with what, you know, they were being genuine, right? I really do believe that they're trying to service their shareholders, right? And I can't blame them. I don't have any hard feelings about it. And once we got into discussions about it, and I think, you know, what really helped was the social media presence. We had, I think, thousands of Canadians write letters of support. And that was fantastic, you know, to see that grassroots level of support, and with the sentiments that you guys had just articulated yourselves, right? So you know, at the end of the day, yes, I never planned for this. You know, I thought Glen Breton had won their case, and I was clear to celebrate my family history with Glenloy and Invermally. But I can understand where they're coming from. So we changed Glenloy to Anloy, and we changed Invermally to Saint Mally. I've still got the family story in there, right? But I don't have those controversial names anymore. And so, you know, we're all moving on from it.
Makes sense. I mean, you did have the support of some Scots as well from Scotland. Like Ralphie in particular was defending your case as well in a video a while back. I can't remember exactly when. You know what? It was in our video actually. It was Ralphie. So the famous YouTuber Ralphie came on the Whisky Rant and spoke. I'm not sure if you saw that episode, but spoke highly of you guys and in your defense as well. So,
he's been a big defender of, you know, victims, if you want to say that, of the Scotch Whisky Association and like their prowess of how they go after, you know, small distilleries. That
did you want to say freedom there?
Yeah, he's a freedom fighter. He's a freedom fighter for Scotch distilleries, or for people that, you know, feel like they're getting stepped on by the Scotch Whisky Association, and he's a big component of speaking out against that. And it's great coming from him because he's a Scotsman, you know.
And it was, and I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed watching, you know, that, and you know, he's spoken on it several times. I think Ralph will be the first to say, and I'll be the first to support, is that the Scotch Whisky Association actually do a lot of valuable stuff. You know, making sure that there's not fake scotches out there, I think, is to everyone's benefit. You know, they're actively negotiating with India to you know, get rid of this 150% trade tariff, right? And that's going to benefit everyone, right? It's not just going to benefit Scotland. Eventually, that will benefit Canada, the US. All the international craft distillers will benefit from getting access to the Indian market, thanks to the Scotch Whisky Association and the good work that they do there. So they have a function and a purpose, and I absolutely support them, and as does Ralph, I believe, too.
I want to talk more about the whiskey, because obviously you're living every whiskey enthusiast's dream, starting your own distillery. Victoria, BC, what are the benefits of distilling there? Obviously, you mentioned really good barley production. The coastal elements you get affect the whiskey as well. I want to speak to the backdrop you're sitting, because you're sitting you have the best office in the planet. It looks like you're sitting beside your two giant stills.
Which one is being worked on right now?
Right, yeah, we can see
ask for a better setting.
This is so cool. Talk to the process about designing the stills, and in the area that you're in, did that affect how you're shaping these with the distillate.
Right. Okay. So, my wife is my long-suffering wife. Andrea is born and bred in Edmonton, and that's where I lived for 25 years. And we decided to relocate to Victoria because when you make a study of the whiskey model, you realize that tourism is a huge component of it. And Victoria is great because we have the cruise ship industry here in Victoria, right? And it's a great tourist destination. So that was one decision point. I'd been out on holiday here, and I thought I died and gone to heaven when I came out here and discovered all the craft beers. The scenery reminded me of Scotland. That's why they called it New Caledonia. And I just love, the hill walking and the beach combing and whatnot, right? But then when it comes to the whiskey making, water's important, not necessarily in the ways that enthusiasts have been told over the decades when they ask awkward questions of tour operators back in Scotland, and they have to come up with an answer for that question, perhaps. And I think there's a few misnomers about the water quality. I mean, out in Edmonton, it's very mineralized water. I don't know that really changes the quality of the spirit per se, but if you're actually living on the prairies and you have got your whiskey in your glass and you put a bit of tap water into your glass, I feel it dampens the nose and dampens the palate with all those minerals, right? And so the great thing about Victoria is we've got really soft water here. I don't think it makes a difference to the spirit, but if you think about the whiskey making process, when I've got in my final spirits receiver a double distillate sitting at 74% alcohol, or I've got a triple distillate sitting at 84% alcohol, and I have to cut that down to 63.5 to put it into the casks. If I'm cutting that down with lovely soft water, I think it preserves the nose of my fruity spirit better than if I was dealing with a heavy mineralized water, right? So anyway, so we came out to the coast then, partly for tourism. The water's a benefit, and a huge benefit, I believe, is being on the island with the ocean breeze and the influence that gets instilled, if you excuse the pun, into our whiskies from that. The stills themselves, the pot stills themselves, because I'm very much a traditionalist, and I love the idea that I'm using a traditional Scotch process and a traditional Irish process, and just fine-tuning it to be the best it can be. I also want to use the best equipment. And so these pot stills behind me, I'll just so you can get the scale of them. Can you still hear me okay with the mic? Yeah. So this is a wash still. You probably can't see it, but it says Forsyths on the man cover or the person cover, personhole cover instead of a manhole cover. Hand hammered in Forsyths in Speyside in Scotland. Half the Scotch industry uses Forsyths pot stills for a reason, because they're the best. The other half of the industry is called Diageo, and they just build their own. They actually bought over Abercrombie Copper Works, and they build their own pot stills now, right? But the other half they use Forsyths. Even Middleton Distillery, who make the most of the Irish whiskey on the planet, use Forsyths as well, right? You might notice as I'm standing, I'm 5'11", right? So you'll see that this is probably a bit taller than a lot of pot stills that you'll see. It's a 5,500 litre wash still, right? So it's one of the largest craft pot stills in North America. Most craft distillers might be 500 litres or 1,000 litres. We're at 5,500. So it's similar to, I think Macallans are probably not much bigger than this. Kilchoman, right? They're in that kind of scale. I asked for a taller neck to get a bit more copper contact and a more patient distillation to give a lighter spirit. The line arm comes down to give us a nice clean cut on it. And then, of course, you've got your shell and tube heat exchangers, is what an engineer would call it. Condensers is what the geeks and punters call it. This is stuffed with copper pipes with cold water in it. And that copper contact, even in these condensers, is really critical for breaking down the big heavy flavors in the spirit and turning them into light volatiles like fruity esters and floral esters. So slow patient distillation with lots of copper contact is critical. So that's the 5,500 litre wash still. Spirit still, 3,650 litres, because you've concentrated the spirit, right? You brought it from a 8 or 10% wash up to a kind of 30% low wines. Put the low wines in here with your foreshots and feints from the previous batch, and you're starting off about 40%. And then by the time that you've collected it, you're up for a double distillation. You're up to about 74%, and then triple distillation about 84%. And the magic happens obviously at the spirit safe, where we're doing the cuts on the pot still. And I'm going to tease you and maybe infuriate you by saying that we do, per Jim Swan's comment, we do the narrowest cut in the Scotch industry. So we're doing a very, very narrow cut, which means we're sending most of that whiskey back to recycle. But I'm going to infuriate you by telling you it's a secret exactly what the cut is. So I'm not going to tell you what that is. The one other secret I've got is just to piss you off even more, is most of the Scotch industry uses M1 yeast. And M1 yeast is a distiller's yeast. It's there for making lots of alcohol. And I said to Jim, give me a second yeast that's going to create more natural oils in the fermentation, because I want to create a creamy, velvety mouthfeel on the palate. And so we have a second yeast in there that's not so much for the alcohol production, it's more for creating some natural oils. So that's my two secrets, but anything else I can tell you.
Well, we're being educated as well, because we don't get this opportunity every day to have someone walk us through
very
skills.
cool.
And really, locally, there's no one at the moment. I think some people are in the works of having something similar, but at the moment, no one has these kind of stills, right? So we actually, personally, I haven't seen them in person.
Very cool. It's like our own private distillery tour.
Yes.
I have a question, and maybe you can reveal a secret about this. We have a whole lineup of your whiskey here, and I'm trying the peated version here for the very first time. Talk about peat, and where are you sourcing your peat from?
Right. So I'm really excited about this. I mean, probably like you guys. I mean, once you become a whiskey connoisseur, you can, I think a lot of people graduate into becoming a peat head, right?
Yeah.
Or we might even call ourselves pathetic peat heads on occasion, right? And you know, nothing like doing the pilgrimage and going back to Islay to have a look at the distilleries in Islay. And it is a once in a lifetime pilgrimage. You know, the Roman Catholics can go off and do the Vatican thing, and the Muslims can do Mecca, but we peat heads have to go to Islay. And it's a great place to go see. But you can have a similar experience coming out to Macaloney's distillery here, because when I wanted to do the peated whiskey, I wanted to do it in a traditional way, but with local ingredients. And what I mean by that is, as an engineer and as a whiskey maker, I wanted to mimic the traditional Islay method of peat smoking the barley, but I wanted to do it with local ingredients. So it's our style. I'm not trying to reproduce a Lafroig or a Kilchoman or a Bowmore. Those are the only three distilleries on Islay that peat smoke their own barley. But I went and visited them to study how they smoke the barley there. And then I came back to Canada, and my cousin happens to be a farmer on the prairies. And if you know any farmers, they're cheaper than Scots, and they're very hands-on. And so I got them to build very cost-effectively a 2-ton peat smoker. Now, Lafroig do 7 tons at a time, right?
Wow.
We're doing 2 tons to start with. So you can see that we're thinking big here. And so that gives me amazing flexibility. And when I studied the process in Islay, and then I brought the local ingredients together, I followed the Islay method, got my barley, sent it off to the top laboratory in Scotland, and it came back at 54 ppm, right? So I nailed it in terms of trying to get that big Islay specification through the process, but it's local ingredients. So you've still got the big juicy Canadian barley coming through there. The peat, and that Canadian barley comes from British Columbia, right? The peat, I call it local because it's just a hop, skip, and a jump across the water on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State.
Okay.
And this will intrigue you now. Westland, who are a great distillery, I've got a lot of respect for Matt, the distiller at Westland. He's just launched his peated whiskey, and guess what? He uses the same peat that we use. So now, as peat geeks, peat heads, we can all compare Westland and Macaloney's and see the difference in processing, because his peat gets sent to Skagit Valley maltings, and they malt the peat in a very different method. It's not a traditional Scotch method, and I use the traditional Islay method, and you can compare and contrast the same peat in two very different whiskies. I think the modifying effect, I don't know if you'll agree with this or not, but because Jim had passed away before I implemented the peat method, right? So I took what I learned from Jim and applied it to the peat method. But I think Jim's distilling regime modifies the peat presentation quite a lot. I don't know if you agree with this, but I feel that our peat for 54 ppm is quite delicate on the nose. Yeah. And it allows the fruity esters to come through and the malt notes to come through, so it doesn't dominate the nose. But then when you drink it, then the peat explodes on the palate, and it's a different peat from any other peat. You know, there's kind of burnt heather and bonfire notes there. I don't know what else you get.
Yeah,
I'm loving the peat profile on this.
This
and
has got to be the best peated Canadian whiskey I've ever had.
This thing, okay, so I got a few things to say. One, I love this peat profile. I get like a very sweet hickory kind of smoke to it. Very, very nice. You put this into recharred Portuguese red wine barriques, adds really good sweetness to it. I think that balance, very, very good.
It kind of reminds me of Kilchoman a little bit.
For the balance in this at the age that it is phenomenal. What's the difference between, because I don't think a lot of people know that Canada has a huge amount of peat bogs, and we were always talking about how Canada distilleries don't utilize Canadian peat. What is the main difference between peat in Canada and peat in Scotland?
Well, let me first off, it's most people aren't able to use different types of peat because, if you want to build your own, if you want to buy a micro malting plant, you're going to invest $250,000 or more, right? Or you have to go to Skagit Valley maltings and you've got access to probably one type of peat. Or you can buy it in from, Baird's in Scotland, right? And you're getting the same peated stuff that pretty much everyone uses over there. So there aren't options for Canadian distillers unless you go figure out what I did, which is how to mimic the Islay process and then have someone build it. And it's a big risk and a lot of time and effort. So it is really tough for people to enter into that kind of playing with peat terroir, right? Now, so what I've done is, because I've got this kind of first mover advantage in this area, and no one else, to my knowledge, has gone out and done this before. No sooner did I do that Washington peat and I put it into the World Whisky Awards as a clearer can you make, and it won World's Best. But then the next year, I thought I'll give it a West Coast spin. And you could argue that there's a Scottish-Irish backstory to this as well, but let's call it a Canadian West Coast spin. And when I was, the next season, when I was doing that Washington peat, I threw on some seaweed onto the fire. I selected the seaweed carefully. And there's a local seaweed farming company that work with First Nations. And First Nations are farming seaweed up in Barclay Sound, pristine Barclay Sound on the west coast of Vancouver, right? You don't get any more pristine than this, right? And I got them to bring two different types of seaweed for me to taste and to burn. And I chewed on this raw seaweed, and one was really blah, really boring. Another one had a sweet note to it. I thought, holy crap, that's really interesting. Then I built my peat fires, and I threw the two types of seaweed onto my Washington peat. And it was almost like a religious experience. It was like smudging myself with this peat smoke. And it was fantastic. Again, this other seaweed species was kind of blah, nondescript, kind of vague ocean notes. But this one that tasted sweet when I chewed it, smelled sweet when I burned it. And so I did a campaign of Washington peat with what's called sugar kelp. Guess why it tastes sweet and smells sweet? It's called sugar kelp. And we did a campaign with that. And I sent that into the World Whisky Awards a year later, and it won World's Best for a second time.
I am not surprised. This is a fantastic peat.
I agree.
It is, honestly, this is my first time tasting it, and I am blown away at how good it is. And is it, so what's the, I mean, it doesn't say whiskey on it. Is this at least 3 years old, or is it's younger, right?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's mind-blowing to me.
It's crazy how these whiskeys drink for their age. Like, you would never put an age, you would never think that this is this young of spirit and whiskey. It's like, it's crazy.
And this is the beauty of peat done properly.
Yes.
Is that you don't have to be that old. Octomores told us that long ago, that you don't have to be older than 5 years old to be incredible.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, something to be very, very proud of.
Like, you have to, excellent. You guys have to be just, so blown away by the quality and the production that you're releasing right now. Like, what do you envision your distillery being in the years to come? Do you envision like these being, the best Canadian whiskey without a doubt when you get a little bit of age on this? Like, is that something that bigger scale? Like, what's the grand scheme of this in the future of your distillery?
Well, so I mean, it's a whiskey geek turned whiskey maker. And so and for the last 5 years I've been pouring whiskey at clubs across Canada. Now I can't do much more of that, right? Because there's not enough time in the day. And so I've got a whiskey ambassador that I've trained up. It is a brilliant job. But that keeps them close to the whiskey geeks, right? And their passion and my passion. I love the idea that we're taking traditional Scotch and traditional single malt and traditional Irish pot still processes, doing them here in Canada and beating the pants off the old country.
Right?
Yeah. And I think Canadians appreciate that we're trying to make whiskey the best it can be in those styles, true to style, but we're doing it here in Canada, right?
Yeah.
And I get a kick out of that, and I think the connoisseurs and the clubs get a kick out of that as well. So I don't know, we just beat that Kildara took on a 12-year-old redbreast, a 15-year-old redbreast, a 21-year-old redbreast, and a 25-year-old redbreast, and it beat the lot of them, right? And the secret is it's less than 4 years old.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Right. Now I don't know if I can pull this off or not, but you've tasted the young peat there. Could I do the same with the peat at some point? And could I possibly take on the Scots and beat them at their own game, right?
Honestly, there's no doubt in my mind. I mean, that you're telling me that's either 1 or 2 years old, and the way that drink, like, it's zero heat to it whatsoever at 46%.
Mm-hmm.
Flavor for days. The nose is beautiful. It's like a heathery, but there's some different elements of peat in there as well that would indicate almost Isla. It has that Isla vibe, like I said, Kilhoman a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then the flavor is just unbelievable.
Yeah. This is just like, it's a refreshing take, especially for us Canadians, because like Canadian whiskey for the longest time, in our opinion, has been branded and sold as a mixer, as it's corn, it's rye, it's whatever blended together. But the single malt that's coming out now in North America, the US
specifically in BC.
Yeah, BC specifically, the US is starting to do it as well. We are obviously huge single malt people. Just such a refreshing take for Canadian whiskey. Super excited to where it's going. And, your distillery is just doing magical things and you're getting amazing results at super young ages. So we're beyond excited to see where this distillery is going. I mean,
absolutely.
You got to be so excited and so proud of the stuff you've done so far.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, Canadians deserve it, right? Because in Canada, we rank in the top 10 biggest single malt consumers on the planet, right?
Yep.
So I think we deserve to have some good stuff on our home ground. So and we're not the only ones, right? I mean, I'll give a shout out to Shelter Point up Island, Lone McKinnon in Vancouver. There's a very young distillery in Calgary, Two Pine Ventures, Bragg Creek, and then Divine here as well. They're all doing fantastic stuff with single malt whiskies. So it's on the up and up and up. Just as a little teaser before we move on from the peat, because I'd sent you guys the mini pack that had essentially the 3 Irish style, right? The 3 pot stills with a peated and an unpeated single malt in there, right? That mini pack I think is what you got.
Yeah.
I'm going to be sending you a peated mini pack in a couple of weeks' time. And it's for the official launch of our peated whiskey. And if you want to do another session at that point, once you've had a chance to go through that mini pack, I won't talk about it now, but I'd like to explore peat terroir a little bit more with you. But let's leave that for another session to entice your followers to maybe tune in again.
Are you suggesting that you source your peat from several different locations? Is this what?
I'm not saying anymore. You're going to have to wait for my package and a cover letter with it.
That's very exciting, actually. Honestly, I'm giddy. Like, I'm actually really happy.
Because have we had Canadian peated whiskey before? Have we or not?
Well, only aged in a peated barrel.
Right, aged in a peated barrel, or they source their barley from Scotland that's been peated already, right?
And that's kind of like the hack that every North American distillery is trying when they're doing single malt is they're sourcing their barley from Scotland that's already
been peated
and bringing it here. But
I don't think we've had this
is a Canadian barley.
Yeah, this is great.
That's being peated in Canada.
And it's about time.
Unheard of.
It's about time that our peat gets used because we have so much.
Well, it's a North American peat, but the barley is Canadian, which is important.
So
in the next session we can talk about Canadian peat as well.
There we go. I figured that. I thought that was coming.
Yeah.
Perfect. I'm looking forward to that because it's important to know that. I mean, it's important to know that if whatever happens, we can rely on our Canadian roots to continue to fill this bar behind me.
There was a headline that said that Scotland was losing its peat at a rapid pace.
That's right.
And I don't know how much that is legit or not, but
it's everything though. Yeah. It's the way the prices of everything are going, and who knows if in 5 years time, the average single malt coming out of Scotland is going to be $400. You don't know, right? We don't know where prices are headed, and if it can be done locally, maybe that'll help Canadians.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's really cool. I'm really excited about the next video.
Yeah.
Focused on people. Let's pivot a little bit to what we have here. I want to go back to this one because this one in particular is the Inverna Haven, and has this been submitted already to San Francisco? Or
no, I don't think so. Because I was a little bit gun shy about submitting it because it's a great seller, but it's a big sherry bomb, right? Yeah. And I don't know if the judges might score it down because it's a big sherry bomb, but a bunch of us love sherry bombs. I love them, right?
Yeah.
Old style Macallans, Glendronach, Saber Lowers. But I think I was thinking about it. I thought, what the heck, we'll put it in and see how it does, right?
I think you should. And the reason I say that is, I mean, I don't know how old it is. I'm assuming between, like I said earlier, 3 and 6. But it punches way above its weight class. You know, it's drinking on par with a 12-year-old Scotch.
Yeah,
I would say, and better than many of them.
Matured in PX and Oloroso, right up Rob's alley. He loves the big, the big dark juicy sherry bombs. 46% ABV. Everything we've tasting in front of us, 46% ABV. Was that something that you really were set on doing, bottling at that strength?
Yeah. I didn't want to go less than that because I think you get a bit of a watery presentation. And 46% with the oils and the alcohol. Actually, there's a chemistry behind it that brings the flavors together. And you and I, right, we recognize that as better flavored. And people that put it out at 43% and 40%, I think, are missing the point here from a connoisseur's perspective. So I think minimum 46. We do single cask bottlings in the 55 to 57%. In the BC LDB at the moment, you can get Invernahaven, I think, at 57% in the BC liquor store. And we will be releasing more cask strength whiskey when we can find stores that want them, right? Because not everybody wants to carry cask strength, right?
So what would you say roughly is the oldest barrels that you have in your distillery at the moment?
Well, you know, let me answer it this way, because you know, I think I don't. You know, there's still a bunch of Scotch snobs and age snobs out there, right? And you guys are helping to educate them that no, you shouldn't be focused on age, right? Yeah. So I really, you know, there's a reason why we don't put age statements on our whiskies, right? But let's just say that, you know, I started distilling in late 2016. Because we're funded at grassroots level, I almost ran out of money the first year, and so I couldn't make very much whiskey in the first year. So all of that whiskey has been, well, the last of it's getting bottled now. No, actually, no, I think all of that first year stuff has been bottled. So you can figure out the math yourself, right? So,
yeah, fair enough. I think this is the Portuguese wine cask. Which one was that again?
A couple of them are in Portuguese wine.
The non-peated.
So the little backstory to that was that it was a Jim Swan innovation. I don't know if you've heard about it or not, but this is a stave from a Portuguese red wine barrique, and you might see the red wine stain just below the surface of the charcoal. And I always do a heavy crocodile char on my wood. I just like that. Maybe it adds a little extra dimension, a hint of smokiness, even unpeated stuff. But what Jim did something miraculous with this technique, and he partnered with a cooperage in Oporto, in Portugal, and as you guys know, every bourbon cask, every wine cask will have been through a toast and a char before the wine or bourbon goes into it. That gets disgorged, and then it gets sent straight to the Scotch or the Irish or the Canadian distillers, still dripping wet, right, of the wine, or still dripping wet from the bourbon. And then we put our whiskey in it. And that's the normal method. Jim Swan said that process is important. And he did an experiment where after this red wine had been emptied, he scraped the charcoal off and he retoasted it and recharred it a second time. And so now that oak has been through 2 heat treatments, and it breaks down the oak structure. It makes the stave a bit thinner, and it allows the oak influence to be much more powerful than a traditional cask. And it was pure genius on Jim's part. And the other thing that you'll notice, I think you noticed it already, but I'll give you the explanation of it. These Portuguese red wine barriques they bring a sweetness to the wine, to the whiskey, and almost like a kind of caramel or butterscotch or toffee sweetness. And that's because the wood structure has been broken down. And the red wine, which is a dry acidic red wine, has been caramelized in the wood. And it's been sweetened and caramelized. So you're getting a natural caramel in here. But when you break down the wood, that wood gets extracted into the whiskey. And believe it or not, in the cask, when some of those wood notes get oxidized 3 times in a row to produce a toffee or butterscotch flavor that you and I might recognize. And so you'll have noticed as a connoisseur, if you leave a whiskey in the glass to develop in the glass and you go back to it after 20 minutes, you might notice, oh, hey, there's more of a butterscotch or toffee note to it than there was before. That's the lignin breakdown component that's now been finally oxidized for the 3rd time. And that develops in the glass because it doesn't fully oxidize in the cask. And so Jim did miraculous things. He caramelized the red wine to make it a sweet red wine. So you get the red berry notes, but you're getting a caramel sweetness. And then you're getting the kind of toffee notes from the broken down wood as well. It's a spectacular cask, and I love working with it.
That's very cool. Very interesting.
So are we did I catch that correctly? Did Jim technically invent the STR style?
Yes.
I had no idea that was wow, that's really, really cool.
Yeah. I mean, Jim, by the way, Jim also, Balvenie will argue this, but Jim advised Glenmorangie to pioneer finishing of whiskey. Up until that time, all Scotch and Irish whiskey had been left in one cask and then bottled. And Jim went back to Glenmorangie and said, look, your original Glenmorangie is a fine whiskey, but I've been experimenting and I put it into a port pipe and I finished it in a port pipe. I think this is commercial. You should commercialize this. And that was the genesis. That was the invention of finished whiskies at that instant. Now, Balvenie might argue the toss on that because Balvenie at the same time came up with a double wood independent of Jim Swan, right? Yeah. So you can argue the toss. Did Jim invent whiskey finishing, or was it simultaneously invented by Jim and by Balvenie?
So you're saying that he was responsible for the Quinta Ruben, like the essential, like that first. He invented the Quinta Ruben, yeah,
and the Lasan.
Yeah,
totally, yeah. And then he went on and invented this shaved toast recharge method.
Wow.
That's so this absolute legend, as you described him earlier, is involved in this Canadian distillery. And I personally think that not enough people know about you guys. I mean, like, we've had one bottle of Macaloney's on the LCBO shelf, and it wasn't quite a whiskey yet. It was a single malt.
Yeah, Magna Bracha.
Yeah.
If people can buy the last 50 bottles of that Magna Bracha, maybe I can get something else into the LCBO.
Yeah, they probably are like, you have to sell this first before you get a new one in, right?
The LCBO is such a weird organization because you have this incredible distillery out west that you could be showcasing as homegrown Canadian stuff.
Yeah.
And people have only seen one expression in it.
Yeah.
Of it in Ontario.
And that Magna Bracha that's in the LCBO now, that is using the shaved toast recharge. So if anybody that's listening wants to experience it, that's the best way to try it, is to buy a bottle of the Magna Bracha.
Yeah, and we tried that during that Ralphie video, and we were really impressed.
Very good.
Because we were like, okay, this is not quite a whiskey yet, technically.
Yeah.
Quote unquote. But it's fantastic.
Absolutely.
Again, punching way above its weight class. So yeah, I highly recommend you guys go buy those 50 bottles because we need more Macaloney's in the LCBO.
We do. We need a recycle of more options, 100%.
Yeah. So I guess this is the part one of what will be a part two eventually when we go through that peated stuff. I'm really excited about it. And I know Jeremy, I could tell he was pretty excited once he started nosing that peated whiskey as well.
Yes.
Yeah, so I guess let's did you have any more questions or?
I have 1,000 more questions. I'm super interested in your distillery, but let's save it. We'll talk more peat, talk more Canadian peat when we get there.
We'll make this a part 2 very soon.
Yeah.
Any chance you're coming up to Ontario in the next little while, or?
I say our whiskey ambassador Robin Morgan is based in Toronto, and he does whiskey club tastings all over the province. He was out in Barrie last night, doing a tasting out there for the whiskey club out there. He's done all the companions of the Quaich Whiskey Club. So if anyone has a whiskey club and they want Robin to come and do a tasting for them, we'll bring in the range of whiskies and he'll pour them for the club.
Yeah.
And because people can, even though you've only got the one whiskey in the LCBO stores, hey, if LCBO wants to buy more product from me, that's great. But as a connoisseur, you can go to our website and we'll deliver 2 bottles for free anywhere in Canada.
That's a cool option. Yeah.
So.
And really, you're not getting that kind of service anywhere else.
Yeah, and we'll definitely throw that link in the description of this video if you want to take a look. But yeah, I mean, I think the takeaway is that we're super excited about the whiskeys coming out, and yeah, I mean, like, I think that it's a fresh take, the things that you're doing, and no wonder why these awards are coming in, because you're giving these tasters something they've never tried before in combinations that they've never experienced. And it's just, I'm super excited for Canadian whiskey, for single malt, and for the stuff that's coming out of your distillery. It's so inspirational and so refreshing, and so happy about it.
It's a 7-year-old distillery, or almost 8, I guess. And it reminds me personally of the Bruichladdich distillery story, like how that kind of evolved into what it was, and the moving parts involved in that, and like, I mean, it's really cool. Like, you guys have a huge history backing you already before you've hit your 10th year.
It's like our favorite whiskeys being made in our backyard with a new spin on it, and it's just interesting.
Exactly.
It's really cool.
Yeah, very cool.
But I think for me, the other cool aspect of this is that, I mean, I've called it, I hope it doesn't sound glib, but I call it, this distillery was built by Canadians for Canadians. And what I mean by that is, I don't have a bunch of savings, right? And so I had to remortgage my house, put another, BC, by the way, stands for bring cash, right? So houses are freaking expensive here, right? So I've already got a mortgage, and then I had to persuade my wife, my long-suffering wife, to add $160,000 onto the mortgage. And then I went from coast to coast across Canada, talking to whiskey clubs, pouring some Jim Swan's Cavalan and some Arran Scotch Whisky 10-year-old, and asked it blind and saying, what do you prefer? And people all preferred this 3-year-old Cavalan because Jim Swan had made it in a blind tasting, right? And I said, right, here's the dream. Give me your money and I'll put it towards building a distillery. So we were doing crowdfunding before crowdfunding platforms existed in Canada. And I was just doing it through whiskey clubs. And we're still, I mean, we're about a year and a half away from being break even, right? So I'm still raising crowdfunding money. So if anyone wants to go visit our site, website, you can see if you want to be a part owner of this, you can have at it, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the perks are lots of perks. We're running an academy that's free for our investors. We've just relaunched it. Public can buy into it. We've just launched it now. It's a 2-day academy where you get lectures, and we take you into the barrel room so you can pull samples. Up here, sampling the clearage as it comes off the pots, and a little blending class as well. So it's a great academy, 2 days. If you're an investor, that's free. And discounts on the whiskies as well as an investor. You get a cool jacket that says owner of Macaloney's Distillery on the shoulder, all that kind of. And then, of course, there's a return on investment. Eventually, hopefully, people will make money as being a small investor. We've got 700 Canadians from coast to coast. Wow. And they're not millionaires. They're punters like you and me that just for the passion of it wanted to see this happen, right? So
That's really cool.
Very, very cool story. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that.
Okay, so anything else you would like to share before we sign off for part 1? And there will be another opportunity to do this very shortly, but honestly, this was an absolute this went, I mean, you always have an expectation, we were excited about this and we thought it was going to be excellent, but it surpassed my expectations as far as what happened tonight. Really, really cool talking with you, Graeme. That was very inspiring. Very, very cool.
Fantastic. So as a teaser, next time we'll talk about the peated whiskies, and 2 of them have already won Canadian Best, so you'll get to try them. And I'll also be talking about a new whiskey trail next time as well that we're putting together. So.
Okay.
Awesome.
Very nice.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much,
Graeme. It was such a pleasure, and thank you so much for joining us. And until next time.
Until next time, part 2.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you guys, Robin, and taking the time. Right? I mean, it's just you're taking a lot of time out of your own life here to share with other people what's new and exciting, and I appreciate your support. So thank you.
We're not as busy as you, I'm sure.
It's our pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. Cheers, guys.
All right, we'll talk to you again.
Thank you.